It was a shock to all Australians.
2 girls, 1 9, 1 7, and a little 4-year-old boy.
Warning, this is a true crime story. The following program contains real events that include violence and sensitive topics. Some viewers may find certain details disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
January 26, 1966. Australia Day. The kind of day that feels almost too perfect. Blue sky pouring down over a packed beach, children chasing waves, families laying out their towels, the whole country celebrating itself. And somewhere in that crowd, on a golden stretch of sand at Glenelg Beach in Adelaide, South Australia, 3 small children were playing in the shallows. 9-year-old Jane, 7-year-old Arnna, and little Grant, just 4 years old, who had barely learned to swim but was fearless anyway. They had caught the 8:45 bus from their home that morning, coins jingling in Jane's small purse, sunburned shoulders and salt in their hair by noon. By 2 o'clock, their mother was standing at the front door, watching the street. By 5:30, their father had driven every road between home and the beach, looking for 3 faces he would never see again. The Beaumont children did not come home that day. They did not come home the next day, or the month after that, or the year after. They have never come home. And today, 60 years later, with their parents both gone to their graves without answers, the case is still open. The ground is still being dug. The question is still being asked. What happened to Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont? Welcome to Vanished Women and Children. My name is Joe, and this channel exists because the most vulnerable among us, women and children, go missing, get hurt, and get failed, and the world moves on too quickly. We don't move on here. We say their names. We sit with the weight of what happened, and we hold the system accountable when it drops the ball. If you are new here, please subscribe before we go any further. Every view, every subscriber, every share keeps these stories alive. And these stories need to be alive because somewhere out there, someone might be watching this video who knows something. Someone might finally decide that the secret they've been carrying for 60 years is heavier than their silence. Hit the bell, subscribe, share this with someone. You never know who needs to see it. Now, let's go back to Adelaide. To understand what happened to the Beaumont children, you have to understand the world they lived in. 1966. Australia was a country that trusted itself. Front doors were left unlocked. Children walked to school alone. Parents sent their kids to the beach with enough coins for a meat pie and the bus ride home, and felt not one flicker of fear about it. That was simply life. That was simply Tuesday, or in this case, a public holiday. Jane, Arnna, and Grant had actually been to Glenelg Beach the day before, January 25th, dropped off by their father Jim, a former serviceman and taxi driver who was preparing for a 3-day sales trip to Snowtown. The kids had come home fine. They'd had a wonderful time. So when the next morning dawned even hotter and the 3 of them asked their mother Nancy if they could go back, she said yes. Nancy Beaumont gave them 6 shillings and 6pence, just enough for bus fare and a small snack. She told Jane to look after her younger siblings. She watched them walk out the front door. She did not watch anything unusual, because there was nothing unusual to watch. 3 Australian kids heading to an Australian beach on Australia Day. The most ordinary thing in the world. They caught the 8:45 bus. They were expected home by noon. What we know about the next few hours comes from a patchwork of witnesses. People who were at the beach that day and came forward after the disappearance was reported. None of them knew, in the moment, that they were watching history. They were just watching kids play. Witnesses saw the 3 children on the sand and in the shallow water during the morning. They were building things, chasing each other, doing what 4 and 7 and 9-year-olds do when you set them loose on a beach. Nothing alarming, nothing wrong. But then there was a man. Multiple witnesses described him. Tall, thin, tanned, blonde to light brown hair, somewhere between his mid-30s and his early 40s. He wore swimming trunks and moved with the kind of ease that made him blend right in. He was not hiding. He was in broad daylight, in a crowd, talking to 3 children. And at some point, those 3 children began playing with him. Not nervously, not reluctantly, but happily, like they knew him. This is the detail that haunts the case, and I'll come back to it. At 12:15 in the afternoon, witnesses saw Jane, Arnna, and Grant leave the beach with the man, not running, not crying, walking alongside him, easy as anything. Minutes later, at around 12:20, 9-year-old Jane walked into Wenzel's Cake Shop on Mosley Street, just near the beach. She bought meat pies, pastries, buns, and fizzy drinks. She paid with a 1-pound note. Now here is why that matters. Jane had been given 6 shillings and 6pence that morning, not a pound. A pound was nearly 4 times what she had started with. Someone had given her money, and the shop employees, who knew the Beaumont children and had served them before, told police the kids had never bought meat pies. They didn't even like them. That bakery was the last confirmed sighting of Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont. When the noon bus came and went without the children, Nancy told herself to be patient. When the 2 o'clock bus came and went, she started to pace. By the time Jim arrived home from his trip, the hollow feeling that had been building in her chest all afternoon had turned into something she couldn't name. Jim drove to the beach. He walked the sand, called their names, checked the amusement areas nearby. Nothing. He drove back past every route between the beach and home. Nothing. At 5:30 in the evening, 5.5 hours after his children were supposed to have walked through the front door, Jim Beaumont stood at the counter of the Glenelg police station and reported 3 children missing. The officer who took the report told him the children had probably just lost track of time. Within 24 hours, the entire nation knew their names. Within 3 days, the headline that ran in Australian newspapers read, "Sex crime now feared. 3 children under the age of 10, one of them barely out of toddlerhood." And that was the headline. Some things haven't changed as much as we think they have. Police launched the largest search in South Australian history. Airports and railway stations were monitored. Boats patrolled the Potawalonga boat haven after a woman reported seeing 3 children matching the Beaumont description there around 7 o'clock that evening. The haven was drained. Nothing was found. Search teams combed sand dunes, scrubland, and every structure near the beach. Volunteers stayed out after dark. Neighboring states were alerted. There were reported sightings stretching for weeks. Children who looked like them spotted in Hobart, Melbourne, New Zealand. Every single lead collapsed. The Beaumont parents remained in their Somerton Park home. Nancy, in particular, could not bring herself to leave. She told people in interviews that it would be dreadful if the children came back and didn't find their parents waiting for them. She stayed. She waited. For the rest of her life, she waited. A reward of £250 was offered initially, and widely criticized as embarrassingly inadequate for 3 missing children. It eventually grew to a $1 million Australian reward that stands to this day. But no one has ever claimed it. Go back with me to a conversation that happened just days before the disappearance. Arnna, 7 years old, told her mother something in passing. She said that Jane had a boyfriend down at the beach. Nancy barely registered it at the time. What mother doesn't hear 100 half-finished sentences from her children in a day? She assumed it meant a playmate, some boy Jane liked playing with in the surf. She moved on. After the disappearance, that sentence didn't let go of her. Because the witnesses who saw the Beaumont children with the man at Glenelg Beach noted something unusual. These were children described by their parents as extremely shy around strangers. Grant in particular was said to be cautious with people he didn't know. But on that beach, with that man, they were relaxed, laughing, playing, at ease in a way you only are with someone you've met before. The prevailing theory, held by investigators for decades, is that the man had met the children on the beach on January 25th, the day before, when Jim had dropped them off, that he had introduced himself, built some small, easy rapport over an afternoon, maybe bought them something, maybe just made them laugh, and that when they came back the next day, they recognized him and ran toward him the way children run toward familiar faces. He had one day to groom 3 children, and he used it perfectly. That's the part that makes this case sit so differently in your chest than most cold cases. It wasn't random, it was planned, or at the very least, it was calculated. Somebody saw those children on a beach, identified them as vulnerable and unsupervised, and came back for them. 2 years after the disappearance, in January of 1968, the Beaumont family received a letter. It purported to be from Jane. The handwriting resembled hers. The letter said the children were alive and living with a man who had appointed himself their guardian. It was measured and warm and completely devastating, because Jim and Nancy Beaumont had spent 2 years not knowing if their children were dead or alive, and here was what looked like Jane's handwriting telling them she was okay. A second letter arrived from the man himself, offering to return the children. He named a meeting place. The Beaumonts went. A detective was with them, though they tried to conceal his presence. No one came. A third letter arrived shortly after, accusing the parents of betrayal for involving police, and stating that he would now keep the children permanently. For 24 years, police and the Beaumont family believed the letters might be genuine. In 1992, forensic fingerprint technology had advanced enough to re-examine them. The letters were traced to a 41-year-old man who had been a teenager when he wrote them, as a prank. He was never charged. The statute of limitations had long since run out. There are no words adequate to describe what it means to learn that some bored teenager in 1968 sat down and wrote letters pretending to be a missing 9-year-old girl, knowing her parents would read them. That he watched the news coverage and let 24 years of hope and agony go on without ever saying a word. The cruelty of that act is its own kind of crime. 10 months after the disappearance, as the investigation was grinding against nothing, a Dutch clairvoyant named Gerard Croiset flew to Australia. He was known for claiming to have assisted in missing person cases in Europe. The press covered his arrival like a movie premiere. Croiset announced that the children were buried beneath a concrete floor in a warehouse near their home, an old brick kiln site. Public desperation to find those children was so intense that $40,000 was raised to demolish part of the building. They dug down 15 feet before the money ran out. Nothing. In 1996, the building underwent partial demolition, and a full search of the site was conducted. Nothing again. People still believed the problem was that they hadn't dug deep enough. That is how badly a grieving public needed an answer. They would fund the demolition of buildings on the word of a man who claimed to see the dead. In a way, it is one of the most human details of this whole case. Over 6 decades, investigators and journalists and ordinary citizens with obsessive spreadsheets have produced a list of suspects that is long and in most cases maddening, because none of them were ever charged and several of them are now dead, and the truth, if it exists anywhere, appears to have gone with them. Let me walk you through the most significant. Harry Phipps. Phipps was an affluent Adelaide businessman, the owner of a casting factory called Castalloy, and he lived 300 meters, barely 3 minutes' walk, from Glenelg Beach. He was tall, blond, and in his mid-30s in 1966. He matched the composite sketch in a way that investigators could not dismiss. He was also, it would later emerge, known to hand out £1 notes to children. Remember that Jane paid for the bakery purchase with a £1 note. In 2007, Phipps's own son Hayden, who was 15 on the day the children disappeared, came forward to researchers and then to police. He said he had seen the Beaumont children in his father's backyard that day. He also said his father had violently abused him throughout his childhood and that Harry Phipps had a sexual interest in children. 2 other men, teenagers at the time, separately came forward to say that Phipps had paid them to dig a large hole, 2 meters by 1 meter, 2 meters deep, in the Castelloy factory yard that same weekend. The ground was sandy and kept caving in. It took them most of the weekend. Workers at the factory later told investigators that Phipps would sometimes walk to one particular spot on the factory grounds, remove his cap, and hold it to his chest, like someone standing at a grave. Ground-penetrating radar was used on the Castelloy site in 2013. A small anomaly was detected. They dug. Nothing was found. In 2018, they returned, went deeper, came up with animal bones and old rubbish. In February of 2025, just last year, as the land had been sold and this would be the final chance, a privately funded excavation led by South Australian MP Frank Pangallo went wider and deeper than any previous dig. 7 days of work by forensic archaeologists, earth-moving equipment, and university students who had studied clandestine graves. They found nothing. Pangallo told reporters afterward that he had received significant information from extremely credible people, and that the investigation into that site was far from over in his mind, even if the physical ground had been exhausted. Harry Phipps died in 2004. He never confessed. He never was charged. His family has consistently maintained that the allegations against him were a smear campaign. Bevan Spencer von Einem. Von Einem was convicted in 1984 of murdering 15-year-old Richard Kelvin, the teenage son of an Adelaide newsreader. He was sentenced to life and never left prison. He died on December 5, 2025, just 6 months ago. South Australian major crime detectives reportedly visited him on his deathbed. He did not speak. An informant known only as Mr. B came to police with a disturbing account. He claimed that von Einem had bragged about taking 3 children from a beach, described performing what he called brilliant surgery on them, said that one of the children died as a result, and that he had eventually disposed of the bodies in bushland south of Adelaide. Mr. B also said von Einem admitted to taking 2 girls from an Adelaide football match. Von Einem was only 19 in 1966, significantly younger than the mid-30s age the witnesses described. His known victims were teenage boys, not young children. And Mr. B, investigators found, got key details wrong, but the shadow lingered. A figure photographed watching police search a stormwater drain in the days after the Beaumont disappearance bore a striking resemblance to a young von Einem. The man standing beside him in that same footage appeared to match the composite sketch of the man seen with the children on the beach. It may mean nothing. It is also the kind of detail that doesn't leave you alone. Arthur Stanley Brown. In 1970, 4 years after the Beaumont children vanished, 7-year-old Judith McKay and her 5-year-old sister Susan disappeared in Townsville, Queensland. They had been walking to the bus stop for school. Witnesses saw them talking to a middle-aged man in a cream-colored car. The girls were found 2 days later in scrubland on the outskirts of town. Both had been sexually assaulted. Both had been murdered. Judith had been stabbed and beaten. Susan had been stabbed repeatedly. Their hands were bound. Their killer had tried to cover them with grass and stones. For nearly 30 years, no one was charged. Then in the early 1990s, Arthur Stanley Brown, a respected, well-dressed Queensland state government employee, drunkenly admitted to colleagues on 2 separate occasions that he had killed 2 girls he called a couple of Sheilas and left them out bush. Both times, the people who heard him dismissed it. He seemed like a decent man. He couldn't possibly mean it. A relative who saw Brown on a television segment about the McKay case in 1998 finally went to police. Brown was arrested. During interviews, he admitted picking up 2 girls from a bus stop, but claimed he had left them in the car while he visited a friend inside, and came back to find them gone. He was charged with the murders of Judith and Susan McKay. His trial was stayed. He had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He died in 2002 at 90 years old, having never faced a jury. For the McKay family, it was yet another betrayal by a system that had twice heard this man confess and done nothing. Brown was in his mid-50s in 1966, older than the man witnesses described at Glenelg Beach. Records of his movements in Adelaide that year were largely destroyed in the 1974 Brisbane floods. No evidence places him there. But his case reveals something that echoes through the Beaumont investigation like a refrain. When a man is well-dressed and well-regarded, his admissions get explained away. His crimes get dismissed, and children die. 7 years after the Beaumonts vanished, in 1973, 2 more children disappeared in Adelaide. 11-year-old Joanne Ratcliffe and 4-year-old Kirsty Gordon were taken from a football match at Adelaide Oval while their parents were in the stands. Witnesses outside the Oval reported seeing the children looking distressed as they walked with a man. The police composite sketch from the Adelaide Oval case bore an unnerving resemblance to the 1966 sketch from Glenelg Beach. Same city, similar circumstances, similar man, 7 years apart. Investigators have long believed the same person was responsible for both disappearances. Joanne and Kirsty were never found either. Their case is also still open. This is the part of the story that I come back to every time I think about these children. In 1966 Australia, there was no sex offender registry. There was no centralized national database for missing persons. There was no interagency system for sharing information across state lines. When a Queensland man confessed to murdering 2 children, police in Adelaide had no mechanism to connect that to a case in their own city. When a factory worker in Adelaide was rumored to have a sexual interest in children, there was no file that connected that rumor to anything else. The system wasn't just slow. It was structurally incapable of protecting children from the kind of predator who crossed geographic and social boundaries. And the social context made it worse. In 1966, the recorded rate of rape in Australia was 2.8 per 100,000 people. Not because it was rare, but because it was almost never reported and almost never prosecuted. Sexual abuse of children was not discussed publicly. There was no language for grooming. There was no framework for understanding how a man could meet 3 children on a beach one afternoon and come back for them the next day. The Beaumont case was the beginning of that conversation in Australia. A painful, brutal, belated beginning. After 1966, parents began keeping tighter hold of their children. Schools started teaching stranger danger. Legislators eventually introduced laws to warn communities about sex offenders. The Amber Alert infrastructure that exists now, the missing children databases, the interagency cooperation, it all has roots, in part, in what happened to those 3 children. The cruelest trade imaginable, 3 children's lives in exchange for a system that might protect the next ones. I want to spend a moment here because this channel is about the people behind the cases, not just the cases themselves. Jim and Nancy Beaumont stayed in their Somerton Park home for years after the disappearance. Nancy refused to leave because she could not bear the thought of the children returning and finding no one there. She cooperated with every investigation, every journalist, every lead, no matter how implausible. She entertained the psychic. She opened the hoax letters with shaking hands and read them believing they were from Jane. She sat for interviews. She answered the same questions over and over and over across decades. Jim and Nancy eventually separated in the 1980s and divorced not long after. The weight of what happened to their family is not a weight most marriages survive. Computer-generated images were released in the 1990s showing what Jane, Arnna, and Grant might look like as adults. Nancy reportedly couldn't bear to look at them. Nancy Beaumont died on September 16, 2019, in an Adelaide nursing home. She was 92 years old. Jim Beaumont died on April 9, 2023. They both went to their graves not knowing what happened to their children, not knowing where they are, not knowing who took them. There is no sentence in the English language that adequately holds that. As of today, the Beaumont case is the oldest active missing person investigation in Australian history. South Australian police maintain a policy that no murder case is ever officially closed. The $1 million reward for information still stands. The case number is still open. Detectives still receive calls about it. At one point, investigators noted they were getting as many as one call every 4 days. The land at the Castilloy factory site has been sold. The 3 major excavations have been completed. There are no more buildings to demolish, no more concrete floors to pull up. The children themselves, if they were alive today, would be in their 60s. Jane would be 69. Arnna would be 67. Grant would be 65. Instead, they exist in the world as 9 and 7 and 4, frozen in the last photographs taken before January 26, 1966. The man who was seen with them, the tall, tanned, blond man in his mid-30s, would be in his 90s now, if he is still living. He may be dead. He may have spent 6 decades living a quiet and ordinary life somewhere, taking what he knows to his own grave. Bevan Spencer von Einem died last December. Harry Phipps died in 2004. Arthur Stanley Brown died in 2002. One by one, the men who were suspected and never charged have left the earth. And we still don't know. I think about what this case means for our channel specifically, because we talk about missing women and children, and we talk about how the system fails them. And the Beaumont case is one of the most instructive examples in modern history of exactly that failure. Not just the failure to find the children, the failure that came before, the cultural failure that told parents their kids were safe without a second thought, the legal failure that had no registry, no database, no framework, the investigative failure that allowed a man to confess to killing children and be dismissed because he dressed well, the institutional failure that couldn't connect cases across state lines, the social failure that kept sexual abuse of children in the shadows for so long that there wasn't even a public vocabulary for what had almost certainly happened to Jane and Arnna and Grant. Every improvement that has come since, and there have been many, came at a cost that should make us furious. Not just sad, furious. Children paid for that education with their lives, and the least we can do is refuse to look away. Somewhere in the world tonight, there may be someone who knows something about what happened to those 3 children. Someone who was there, someone who was told, someone who was a child themselves in 1966 and saw something they were too scared to report, who has carried it for 60 years and is running out of time. If that is you, please come forward. South Australian police are still actively investigating this case. The $1 million reward for information stands. You can contact Crime Stoppers Australia at 1-800-333-000. You can contact South Australian Police directly. Information can be provided anonymously. And if that isn't you, if you're just someone who watches this channel because you care about missing women and children, because you want the world to do better by the most vulnerable, then please share this video. Please subscribe. Please keep the conversation going. Because the Beaumont case doesn't just belong to 1966 Australia. It belongs to every case that was mishandled, every predator who was dismissed, every parent who waited and waited and never got an answer. Jane, Arnna, Grant. We haven't forgotten you. We're still looking.